Much has happened on the world of Draenor, since the ancient battle between plant and elemental, when the mighty mountain Grond and the ancient spore mound felled each other. The races born from their destruction lived on, and other races like the Arakoa began to thrive until their self-destruction. But life is always evolving, as we shall see. Don't forget to like and subscribe and come, take a seat by the fire of an alien moon. The pieces that broke off the ancient Leviathans became a species unto their own. We covered how the two races of Breaker and Evergrowth lines were instinctually at war. That was until the Colossals sacrificed themselves in a last desperate act, one that ultimately destroyed the Evergrowth forevermore. But from the bodies of these still mighty beings rose the Magnaron. Life will always find its way. These were huge, lumbering, elemental beings of rock and stone and lava. While predisposed to fighting against the Genosaur, most did not follow the calling of their progenitors, and instead began to roam the plains. They would seek out volcanoes and mountains to call home. Despite their lesser form, they still retained much of their power, carving sigils into the earth and reshaping the world to suit their needs, always furthering a goal that no mortal could ever discern. They simply called this the Great Work. However, the life energies of Draenor had other plans, and the spores of Batan would once again make their way to the surface. These spores would cling to the rock-hewn giants, altering them over time. They would begin to devolve into flesh and into lesser creatures. Each of these devolutions would occur to varying degrees, with each one coming to form a race of its own. These would be Gron, Ogron, Ogre, and Orc. By the time of the Apexis civilization's fall, these descendants of stone had spread across much of the world. The Ogron, while particularly brutish, were the first to learn a hard lesson, that together meant survival, and being alone meant death. They formed rudimentary societies, from which they warred against each other in battles for dominance or territory. The Ogron would enslave what they saw as their lesser kin to the Ogres and Orcs, using them as fodder in great battles. All would fear the rage of the Ogron. However, when the Arakoa that survived began to search for the lost Apexis crystals of their civilization, they found that the Ogron had claimed the territory in which they lay. While they did attempt to treat peacefully with the Ogron, it only ever ended in dangerous aggression. But the Arakoa were smart, relentless, and desperate. They instead began to look to other methods, and devised an ingenious plan. They would instead treat with the more amiable ogres. If they could empower them enough to break free from their captors, it would clear the path. To this end, the Arakoa taught the magic of the arcane to the ogres. There was one ogre in particular named Gog that took to this newfound power. When his time came to unleash his strength upon the world, he did not target the Ogron slavers, but instead he killed the Gron. These mighty beings were feared and revered by all Ogre. He did not stop there, and he began to slay more and more of them. Soon word of his deeds had spread throughout the land. The ogres saw how easily one of their own could destroy their captors, and all the fear that kept them in line began to drift away. What ensued was a particularly brutal and bloody war that saw the Ogron driven to near extinction. Those that were not killed or torn limb from limb would be driven off to far remote locations to hide. Gog then gathered his people and founded the Gorian Empire, and built a mighty city named Goria, which meant seat of the king. The Ogres, being descendants of Agramar, took to the arcane teachings effortlessly, wielding it to impressive precision. But when the Arakoa moved in to gather the Apexis crystals, as was the original deal, Gog put a stop to it immediately, not willing to give up any source of power. Understandably, the Arakoa were infuriated at this turn of events, and resolved to assault the Ogres and take the crystals by force. But they did not know what they had unleashed upon the world by teaching this magic to them. They had replaced one powerful and barbaric race with another. The Arakoa were defeated and subjected to a slow and torturous death. At this time, another descendant of stone, a race known as the Orcs, were also affected. Long had they dwelled in the underground cave systems to hide from the Ogron. But when the Ogres waged their war, it had the benefit of eliminating two of the greatest threats to their survival. For the first time they were able to venture fully to the surface, and even found permanent settlements. It was then that the population of Orcs exploded. So vast had their numbers swelled that hunting and food began to become scarce commodities. They began to turn on each other as tensions between families began to simmer. It was here that lines were drawn, that these families became the first Orcish clans. Some would leave the familiar landscape of Gorgrond, and some would stay. Those that chose to remain with the Black Rock, the Laughing Skull, and the Dragonmaw being among the most notable. Some would travel to the jungle land of savagery and superstition, and become known as the Bleeding Hollow clan. While there were many more clans, the largest and most prominent of the others are the Frost Wolves, the Shadow Moon, and the Warsong clans. Each adopted its own culture and beliefs over time. The most spiritual of them all, the Shadow Moon, would often pilgrimage across the land to search for the divine. It was during one of these many journeys that their clan would experience visions in the north of Nargrand. This was an area that we know as the remains of Gron, but the elemental spirits who dwelled there, named the Furies, would call this the Throne of the Elements. The Shadow Moon elders flocked to this place and would learn to guide and will the elements. They became the first shamans and would gain astonishing powers from this elemental connection. These spiritual teachings would spread to all the clans eventually, with many of them journeying to what had now become a temple. Here they would enter trance-like states in their communion with the land. However, it soon came to be known that other spirits dwelled out there in the great dark. Some members would glimpse the void and lose their minds to it. Their faces would be painted with a skull, signifying them as dead to their people, and sent to the darkness of the caverns beneath the land. The world settled this way, for a few hundred years at least, with life going on much as it once was, with little major incident. However, peace could not last. The Ogres ever sought to expand their empire, and they saw this new power of the Orcs wielded, and attempted to claim the Throne of the Elements for themselves. However, the sudden clash of arcane and elemental magic destabilized the latent power of Gron, and caused an explosion that sent the elements into disarray, and destroyed the temple itself. The Orcs would rally to the defense of these spirits, and the weakened Ogres fled back to their city of Goria, which the Orcs began to lay siege to. They would starve out the Ogres, they thought. In desperation, the Ogre Magi began to search through the Apexis archives until they came upon the Curse of Seed. They would alter and manipulate it in order to use it against the Orcs. They created that day what would come to be known as the Red Pox. Once unleashed, it would spread through the Orcish clans like wildfire, and the siege was over. The elements would not stand by idle as their defenders suffered for their protection. The Orcish shamans gathered to the outskirts of the city and witnessed the elemental devastation that followed. As storms and earthquakes battered the city, the oceans swelled and rose, and fires raged through every escape route. Untold ogres died that fateful night. It would never be forgotten, the true fury of the elements. The surviving ogres would learn to never tamper with such power again. The red pox, however, could not be eradicated. The orcs would learn to live with it, with outbreaks that would happen occasionally. The downfall of Goria had relinquished control of Draenor to the orcs, who were now the dominant race on the planet. As their numbers continued to grow, the ogres would diminish. For another 200 years life would settle this way, until a bright light could be seen descending from the skies. The Draenor had made a crash landing on the peaceful world of Draenor, and their ship had no way to carry them forward. They were left with no choice but to call this planet home. But we will continue this in the next episode. Thanks again for every like and subscribe, everyone, and all of the support. And don't forget to come back anytime.